The wagon stopped, and Sarah Dawson jumped down before her father could touch her, hitting the frozen Montana dirt hard enough to feel it in her teeth. "You said you were saving us," she said, not turning around. "Say it again. Say it to my face." Behind her, a widowed rancher stood on his porch with 3 children who looked at her like she was a ghost wearing their mother's shape. She was 18. She had been given away like a debt paid in flesh, and she had already decided she would not stay bought. If you believe a woman's worth is never something a man gets to trade, subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Sarah's story travels. Her father wouldn't look at her. "Sarah, get your things. They're already down." She'd thrown the one carpet bag off the wagon herself minutes back before he could pretend to help her with it. She wanted no part of his hands. Not now. Not after 4 days of silence on the trail, 4 days where he'd chewed his tobacco and stared at the ruts and called what he was doing God's arrangement, as if God signed contracts. "You can go home now, Pa. That's what you came for. To hand me over and go home." "Don't make it ugly. You made it ugly." She finally turned. His face was gray in the cold, older than it had been a week ago, and some small treacherous part of her wanted to soften. She crushed it. "You made it ugly when you told Mr. Ward I'd come cheerful, when you told him I was agreeable. Did you get a good price for agreeable? That's enough. Was it money or was it the note on the Southfield? Because I'd like to know what I'm worth. Pa. Exactly. To the dollar." Behind her, a boot scraped porchwood. She heard it before her father's eyes cut past her shoulder, and she watched his whole posture change. Chin down, hat brim, tugged the servile little shrink of a man who owed. So this was him. She'd built 100 pictures of Caleb Ward on the road out, and none of them had prepared her for how still he was. He didn't come down the steps. He didn't rush to smooth things. He just stood there with his hands loose at his sides and let the ugliness sit in the yard between all of them, and something about that stillness scared her more than shouting would have. "Mr. Ward," her father said. "She's tired from the road is all. She means it fine." Caleb's voice was low and flat, like a man reading a fence line. "Let her mean it." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Go on home, Dawson," Caleb said. "You've done your part." Her father hesitated one more second of theater, one more chance to play the grieving parent, and then he climbed back up onto the wagon seat and gathered the reins, and Sarah understood, with a cold, complete clarity, that he was actually going to do it. He was going to leave her in a strange man's yard, in a territory she'd never seen, and drive away, and the leaving was the truest thing he'd done in years. "Pa." He didn't turn. "Pa, look at me." The wagon rolled. The wheels bit the frozen ground and turned it, and her father's back stayed straight and set. And she felt the last thread of the girl. She'd been the one who still believed her father would break at the right word, snap somewhere under her ribs. She didn't cry. She promised herself that much. She stood in the yard of a dead woman's house and watched her father shrink to a dot, and then to nothing, and she did not cry. "You can come in," Caleb said behind her. "It's cold. I know it's cold. You'll want to be inside for it. I'll come in when I decide to come in." A silence. She could feel him deciding whether to push, and she braced for it because pushing, she understood pushing, she could fight. But he didn't push. She heard the door open, and the muffled clatter of children ushered indoors, and the door shut again. And when she finally turned around, the porch was empty, and the lamp in the window had been lit, and she was alone in the yard with a bag at her feet, and nowhere on earth to go. That was the worst of it, the nowhere. She picked up the bag. Chapter 5. The oldest boy was waiting just inside the door, arms crossed, and he had a face made for hating her. "You're not my mother," he said. "No," Sarah said. "I'm not." It threw him. She saw it throw him. He'd wound up for a fight, and she'd taken the wind clean out of it. He was 10, maybe all elbows and fury, with his father's dark hair and a jaw that hadn't grown into itself yet, and he'd clearly rehearsed a great deal more than one line. "My name is Eli," he said like an accusation. And that's Clara. A small girl half hidden behind him, 6 or so with wet eyes and a rag doll strangled in both fists. And the baby's Rosie. And you're not going in Ma's room. Nobody goes in Ma's room. All right. You can't just say all right. Why not? He didn't have an answer. He was a boy who'd built a wall out of no, and here was this stranger agreeing with every brick of it, and the agreeing was making the wall useless. His eyes went shiny with frustration. Because you don't get to be nice, he said, and his voice cracked on it, and he hated that it cracked. She could see him hate it. You don't get to come here and be nice and make everybody forget. I'm not going to make anybody forget anything, Sarah said. She set the carpetbag down by the wall. I couldn't if I wanted to, and I don't want to. Clara from behind her brother in a whisper so small it barely crossed the room. Are you gonna cook? Clara, Eli hissed. I'm hungry, the little girl said. And there was such simple wreckage in it, a child who'd been hungry long enough to say so to a stranger, that Sarah felt her own throat close. She'd walked in the door 90 seconds ago, prepared to hate all of them right back. She hadn't been prepared for hungry. When did you eat last? She asked. Neither of them answered. Eli, when did the little ones eat? There was bread, he said defensive. This morning there was bread. It was full dark now. Sarah looked past him into the house. A big house, a prosperous man's house. And cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. A dead fire in the grate. Dishes stacked in gray. A cradle in the corner where the baby was making the thin, exhausted sound of an infant who'd cried herself past crying. Somewhere in the back, she could hear Water Caleb, she guessed, at a pump doing something with his hands so he wouldn't have to be in the room with her. A house full of children going hungry with a rich man in it. Where's the kitchen? She said. Not a question. You're not Eli. She crouched so her eyes were level with his. She didn't touch him. She'd learned that much from her own childhood. You did not touch a cornered thing. I heard you. You're right. I'm not your mother, and I'm not going in that room, and I'm not here to make anybody forget. But that baby's hungry, and so's your sister, and so are you, and I know how to fix that part, just that part. Will you show me the kitchen? He stared at her. For a long moment she thought he'd refuse, thought he'd plant himself and make her fail, so he could be right about her. Then Clara's small hand crept out and took a fistful of Sarah's sleeve, just holding it the way a drowning thing holds anything. And Eli watched his sister do it, and something went out of him. Not the hate. The hate would take months. But the fight for tonight went out of him. It's back here, he muttered, and turned and led her. She found flour salt, a little bacon grease gone hard in a crock, some potatoes with eyes on them. Not much. Enough. She'd fed a family on less. She had Clara pumping water, and Eli sullen watchful bringing wood, and she made a fire, and got a skillet hot, and started frying potatoes, and cutting biscuit dough with the mouth of a cup, because she couldn't find a cutter. And the children hovered at the edge of the lamplight, and watched her with the wary hunger of half-wild animals. Caleb came in when the smell hit. She felt him in the doorway before she saw him. He filled it. He stood there watching his children watch her cook, and she kept her back to him and kept working, and the silence stretched until it was almost a sound of its own. You didn't have to do that, he said finally. Somebody did. She flipped the potatoes. How long since anybody cooked in this house, Mr. Ward? He didn't answer. A while, she said. That's what I figured. There's grease gone to stone in the crock, and the flour's got weevils I had to sift out. That's weeks. That's a man who can't stand to be in his own kitchen. She turned around then, made herself look at him. I'm sorry about your wife. His face did something. It was fast, and it was almost invisible, but she caught it a flinch. He clamped down before it finished. You don't know anything about my wife. No, I don't. I know she's been dead long enough that her children are being fed weevily bread and going to sleep hungry, and I know you're a rich man who could fix that with money, if money was the thing that was broke. But money's not the thing that's broke, is it? Watch yourself. I've been watching myself for 4 days in a wagon, Sarah said. I'm all out of watching myself. She turned back to the skillet because her hands had started to shake, and she'd be damned if he'd see it. Sit down. Feed your children. We can hate each other after they've eaten. There was a silence so long she thought she'd finally gone too far. Then quietly the scrape of a chair. And another. And she heard Caleb Ward sit down at his own table like a man who'd forgotten he was allowed to. And she plated up potatoes and biscuits and set them in front of the children first. And she watched Clara eat with both hands, and Eli try to eat slow to prove he wasn't desperate and fail at it. And something in her chest hurt so much she had to grip the counter. She was 18 years old. She'd been sold 3 days ago. And she was already, God help her, starting to care. They ate. The baby woke, and Sarah warmed milk and fed her, and Rosie fell asleep against her shoulder, mid-swallow, boneless, and trusting the way only babies trust. And Sarah stood there in the strange kitchen, holding a dead woman's child, and felt the trap of it close around her, because you could steel yourself against a cold man. You could steel yourself against a hateful boy. You could not steel yourself against a baby's weight and warmth, and whoever had arranged this, whether her father or God, or plain bad luck, had known that, had counted on it. Caleb watched her hold the baby, and his face was unreadable. She likes you, Clara offered. She likes being warm, Sarah said. That's not the same. Ma used to hold her like that. Clara, Eli said low. She did. Don't talk about Ma to her. It's all right, Sarah said. She can talk about her mother. She should talk about her mother. She looked at Eli. You all should. You're not going to hurt my feelings, and you're not going to make me leave. There's nothing you can say about your mother that'll do either one. So say what you want. Eli's eyes filled again, and he shoved back from the table so hard the chair barked against the floor. I'm going to bed. Eli, Caleb started. I'm going to bed. And he went, and they heard his feet on the stairs, hard and angry, and then a door. Caleb rubbed a hand down his face. He's grieving, Sarah said. He's 10 and his mother's dead, and a stranger's standing in her kitchen holding her baby. He's exactly what he ought to be. She shifted Rosie higher. You want to tell me where I'm sleeping, or is that a fight too? It was in a manner of speaking a fight. Because there were 3 rooms upstairs, the children's the master room that no one entered, and a third at the end of the hall that had been a sewing room, and Caleb stood in the hallway with a lamp, and told her in that flat, fenced-off voice that she'd sleep in the sewing room. And the other room, Sarah asked, is not yours. I didn't ask if it was mine. I asked about it. She wasn't trying to provoke him, or not only that. She was taking the measure of the house the way you'd take the measure of any dangerous ground you had to live on. I'm going to be in this house a long time, Mr. Ward. Years, most likely. I'd like to know the shape of it. That door stays shut. Fine. But I want to hear it from you plain so there's no misunderstanding down the line. No scene where I go in by accident and you look at me like I spat on a grave. Just tell me that door stays shut. Say it and it's done and I'll never touch it. He looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight. That door stays shut, he said. Then it stays shut. I'll never touch it. She meant it, and he seemed to hear that she meant it, and some fraction of the tension in his shoulders let go. Good night, Mr. Ward. Ward's fine, he said. You don't have to Mr. Me. He stopped. The word married sat in the hall between them, unsayable because they'd stood in front of a circuit preacher 2 days back and said words neither of them believed. And it hadn't been a marriage so much as a transfer of property with witnesses. You can just say Ward. All right. Good night, Ward. She took Rosie into the sewing room because there was a second cradle there, his wife's. She guessed everything in this house was his wife's. And she laid the baby down and sat on the narrow bed. And finally, with the door shut and the lamp out, and no one to see, she put her face in her hands. She didn't cry. Even then. She'd made herself a promise. But she sat in the dark a long time shaking, and understood that the life she'd been handed was not going to be the simple cruelty she'd braced for. Simple cruelty she could have survived clean. This was worse. This was a house full of wounded people she was already starting to love against her own will, in a place she hadn't chosen, married to a man who looked at her like an accusation, and the loving was going to cost her everything, and she was going to do it anyway. And she hated that she already knew that about herself. "I won't stay bought," she whispered into the dark to no one. "But I won't let them starve either. Those are two different things. I can do both." She almost believed it. Morning came hard and blue and cold. She was up before any of them, the deep habit of a girl who'd run her father's failing house since she was 12, and she had the fire going and coffee on and dough rising by the time Caleb came down. He stopped on the stairs when he saw her, and there was a strange, arrested look on his face, and she understood it. A beat later, he'd expected the kitchen dark. He'd expected to be alone in it, the way he'd been alone in it every morning since his wife died. The presence of another living person moving in that room was a thing his body hadn't been ready for. "Coffee's hot," she said to save them both. He came down, took the cup she poured without being asked, drank it standing up near the window as far from her as the room allowed. "There's things you'll need to know," he said, "about the place, the work." "I figured. I run 300 head, more riders through the season. There's a foreman, Tom Callahan, been with me 11 years, you can trust him. There's a couple of hands stay through winter." He said all this to the window, not to her. "You'll cook for whoever's here. Keep the house. The children." A pause. "That's the arrangement." "That's the arrangement," Sarah agreed. "And what do I get?" He looked at her. "You bought a wife, Ward. Or my father sold you one, and there's a paper somewhere says so. Fine, I'll cook and clean, and I'll raise those children better than money can, and I'll do it well, because I don't know how to do anything by halves. But I want to know what I get. A woman who works for wages knows her wages. I'd like to know mine." "You get a home," he said. "A roof, food, same as anybody. Anybody can be turned out. I'm not going to turn you out. You could. That's the point. You could put me on a wagon tomorrow, and there's not a soul in this territory would say a word, because I'm 18 and I've got no people and no money and no claim on anything but the paper my father signed. So I want your word, not about turning out, about this." And here, she surprised herself because she hadn't planned to say it. It came up out of somewhere deeper than plan. "I want your word that whatever I build here is mine. If I make this house a home again, if I raise those children whole, if I put my 2 hands into this place for the next 20 years, I want it to be mine, Ward. Not a thing you let me borrow and can take back, because I'll give it everything. But I won't give everything to a thing that isn't mine. I did that once. I gave everything to my father's house, and he sold me off the porch of it. I won't do it twice." The silence after that was different from the others. Caleb set his cup down. "My wife's name was Margaret," he said. She hadn't asked, but she understood he was answering her, that this was in his language the only way he knew to answer her. "She built this. Not the money I made the money, but the home that was her. Every warm thing in this house came out of her hands." His voice had gone rough. "When she died, I couldn't. I let it go cold. All of it. I let my own children go cold, because I couldn't stand to walk into a warm room she wasn't in." He looked at Sarah finally, and there was something naked in it, something that cost him. "I'm not a good man to be married to. I want you to know that going in. I'm not cruel, but there's a part of me that's in the ground with her, and it's not coming back, and you should know that's what you got. A man with a piece missing." "I know what missing pieces look like," Sarah said quietly. "I grew up with a father made of nothing else." "Then you know it doesn't get filled." "No, but it can stop bleeding on everybody else. That much I've seen. My mother did it. She had a piece missing too, and she taught herself not to make the rest of us bleed for it." Sarah wiped her hands on her apron. "So here's what I'll offer you, Ward, and you can take it or send me back to that porch. I'll make this house warm again. I'll do it different than Margaret. I'm not her, And I won't pretend to be, and I won't touch her room or her memory or her place in those children. But I'll make it warm. And in exchange, this warmth is mine. You don't get to take it back. If you can say that we've got a marriage, not a love match, but a marriage. A real one with terms that we both keep. Can you say it? She watched him weigh it. She was 18 and negotiating the whole rest of her life over a cup of coffee with a man who'd buried his heart, and she had no cards, no leverage, nothing but the plain force of her own refusal to be small, and she watched that plainness land on him. Watched him see it. This girl, his money had bought, who was standing in his kitchen, dictating terms like she owned the ground. "You've got sand," he said. It wasn't quite admiration, but it wasn't nothing. "I've got nothing else," Sarah said. "Sand's what's left when they take everything else. Say the words Ward." "What you build here is yours," he said slowly. "I won't take it back. You have my word. And you'll never put me on a wagon." "I'll never put you on a wagon. Then we've got a marriage." She put out her hand like a man closing a deal, because that was the only kind of closing she trusted. He looked at it. And then he took it, her small chapped hand in his large scarred one. And they shook on the terms of a life. And it was the coldest and the most honest thing either of them had ever done. And neither of them knew yet that it was also the beginning of something that would burn this whole valley to a different shape before it was through. Matoa. The foreman found her at the clothesline 3 days later. Tom Callahan was a bandy-legged man of 50 with a white mustache and eyes that missed nothing, and he'd been watching her since she arrived. She knew the way an old dog watches a new one deciding. "Mrs. Ward," he said, and she almost looked around for someone else, because no one had called her that yet. "Sarah's fine." "No, ma'am. On this place, you're Mrs. Ward." He said it firm, and she understood it was a gift that he was telling the other hands through her how it was going to be. "I come to say 2 things. First is them biscuits you sent out to the bunkhouse this morning were the first hot thing them boys had that wasn't burnt in near a year. So, thank you. And the second thing," his face changed. He glanced toward the barn, toward the long, low buildings and the pastures beyond, and he lowered his voice, even though they were alone. "Second thing is, you ought to know what you married into. Not the man, the place. There's trouble on this land, Mrs. Ward, and it's coming to a head, and a woman ought to know when she's standing in the middle of a thing." Sarah stopped with a wet shirt in her hands. "What kind of trouble?" "Land trouble. Worst kind." He worked his mustache. "There's a company been buying up the whole valley these 3 years. Thornton. They come in polite offer to buy, and if you don't sell—" He stopped himself. "Things happen. Fences cut. Water fouled. The Petersons upstream had a fire in their hay last summer, lost the whole crop, and there wasn't a lick of lightning that week. They sold out that fall. So did the Kesslers. So did 4 other families I could name. And Caleb won't sell. Caleb Ward will die before he sells. This is Margaret's land as much as her people homesteaded it. It come to her, it's where she's buried." Callahan's jaw set. "Thornton knows it. And a man who won't sell for money is a man they've got to move some other way." He looked at her steady. "I tell you this because the boss won't. He thinks he can hold it alone out of pride and grief, and he's wrong, and there's nobody in that house been able to tell him so. Maybe there is now." A pause. "You strike me as somebody who says the hard thing. I've been told it's a fault." "Not out here it ain't," said Tom Callahan. He touched his hat and left her at the line with a wet shirt in her hands, and a cold new understanding settling over her that the house full of ghosts she'd married into was not just haunted by a dead woman. It was under siege. And the man she'd shaken hands with, the man with the piece missing, was standing alone against something patient and moneyed and cruel, too proud and too broken to see how close he was to losing everything. "What you build here is yours," he'd said. She'd made him promise it not 4 days ago. And now she stood in the wind and understood that whatever she built here, someone else was already planning to take, not from Caleb, not really. From all of them. From Eli and Clara and Rosie. From her. She hung the shirt. Her hands had stopped shaking days ago. "Not from me," she said to the wind, and her voice had a new thing in it, low and certain and hard. "Whatever you are, whatever you're planning, you're not taking it from me." She didn't know yet what she was promising. She only knew she meant it all the way down. The way she'd meant standing in the yard and refusing to cry. The way she'd meant closing the deal over coffee. Meant it with the whole force of a girl who'd been given away like a debt, and had decided somewhere on that cold road into Montana that she was done being something other people traded. She went back inside to feed the children. Behind her, out past the pastures, past the fence line where Ward land met open range, a rider she never saw sat his horse on a low rise and watched the smoke rise from the Ward chimney. Warm smoke, home smoke, the smoke of a house that had come back to life. And then he turned and rode off to tell the men who paid him that the widower Ward had gone and got himself a young wife, and the place was coming back, and that would have to be dealt with before the spring. Inside, Sarah cut biscuits with the mouth of a cup and did not yet know she'd already begun the fight of her life, but she would. Soon enough she would. And she would not run. The letter came on a Thursday, and it was the first crack in everything. Sarah found it herself because she'd taken over the mail from a hand named Dutch who'd been throwing it unread into a drawer for months. Bills, notices, a whole drawer of a man's life he couldn't bear to look at, and she'd made it her business to sort it at the kitchen table each morning while the bread rose. Most of it was nothing. Feed accounts. A letter from a cattle buyer in Miles City. And then this one thick cream paper of printed letterhead she had to read twice before it made sense to her. Thornton Land and Cattle Company. She didn't open it. It wasn't hers to open. But she sat with it in her hand for a long moment. And she thought about Tom Callahan at the clothesline, and she thought, there's trouble on this land, and it's coming to a head, and her stomach went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the morning. Caleb came in stamping snow off his boots, and she held it up. "This came for you." He crossed the room and took it, and she watched his face when he read the name on it. It went to stone. Not anger would have been better. Anger was hot and human. This was worse. This was a man looking at something he'd been waiting for. "Ward!" He tore it open, read it standing up, and she watched his jaw work and his knuckles go white on the paper, and when he was done, he folded it once very precisely and put it in his shirt pocket and said, "It's nothing. It's not nothing. Your face isn't a nothing face. It doesn't concern you, Sarah. I live in this house. And I run this land, and the land's my business, and the business isn't yours." He said it flat, closing a door, the same flat voice he'd used about Margaret's room. Leave it. She could have left it. A different woman would have left it. But she'd spent 4 days in a wagon promising herself she'd never again be a person. Things happened too. And here was a thing happening right in her kitchen, and the man was folding it into his pocket and telling her it wasn't hers. "Callahan told me," she said. That stopped him. "Told you what?" "About Thornton. About the fences and the fouled water, and the Peterson fire that lightning didn't start. About 6 families sold out in 3 years, and you the last big holdout in the valley." She kept her voice level. "He told me because you wouldn't. And because he thinks a man standing alone against something like that ought to have somebody in the house who knows what's coming. He's right." Caleb's face flushed dark. "Callahan had no—" Don't you dare be angry at that old man for telling me the truth you were hiding." She stood up from the table. "You made me a promise 4 days ago, Ward. You stood right there, and you said what I build here is mine. You want to know why I made you say it? Because I had a feeling. I've lived my whole life on ground somebody else could pull out from under me, and I know the smell of it, and I smelled it on this place before I ever heard the name Thornton. So don't tell me it's not my business. If somebody's coming to take this house, it's the most my business of anything on God's earth because it's the only home I've got, and you gave me your word it was mine." The words hung there. She watched something move behind his eyes, the pride first wanting to slap her down, put her back in the box of cook and keep house and mind the children. And then, under it, something more tired. A man who'd been carrying a thing alone so long he'd forgotten weight was supposed to be shared. "They want to buy," he said finally. "Again. That's the letter. A number this time. A big one." "How big?" He told her. It was more money than she'd ever imagined, in one place, more than her father had failed to earn in 3 lifetimes of failing. And she understood in an instant why families had sold, why the Petersons and the Kesslers had taken it and run. It wasn't nothing money. It was change your whole life money. "And you're not going to take it?" "No. Because of Margaret." His head came up sharp. "I'm not being cruel," Sarah said quieter. "I'm asking. Because if you're holding this land out of grief, that's one thing, and it's a thing that could get those children killed. But if you're holding it because it's right, because you won't be run off by men who burn out their neighbors, that's another thing, and it's a thing I'll stand next to you on. So which is it? Tell me true." The kitchen was silent, except for the fire. "Her grandfather broke this ground," Caleb said. "Dug the first well by hand. Her father added to it, and I married into it, and we built it up together into the best outfit in the valley, and every foot of it's got her family's sweat in it, and now her body's in it up on the rise under the cottonwood. And Thornton wants me to sell it to them so they can run their cattle over her grave." His voice had dropped to something terrible and low. "So yes, Margaret. And also right. It's both, and I won't untangle them for you because I can't, because they're the same thing to me now. This land is her, and holding it is right, and I will die before Thornton runs a single steer over that woman's bones." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. "All right. You asked me once, could I say a thing plain? That was plain. I believe you." She sat back down at the table and picked up the next letter in the stack like it was any ordinary morning. "Then we're not selling. And we'd better start figuring how a man holds land against a company that burns people out because pride and a dead wife aren't going to be enough ward. And I think somewhere under all that, you already know it." He stared at her, and that was the first crack, not in her and him. The first hairline crack in the wall he'd built where a little of the aloneness leaked out, and for just a second, he let her see how scared he'd been holding it all by himself. Then Rosie cried from the next room, and the moment closed, and Sarah went to see to the baby, and the day went on. But something had shifted. She'd made herself part of it, whether he liked it or not. Dead. Eli made her pay for it. She'd known he would. A boy that wounded didn't hand over ground for one shared dinner, and the day after the letter, he started up again worse than before, knocked over the water bucket she'd just filled, and stood there daring her to be angry. Left the barn gate open, so a heifer got out, and she and Callahan spent an hour chasing it, and worst of all took to standing in the hall outside Margaret's shut door, just standing there staring at Sarah whenever she passed, like a small furious sentry guarding his mother's tomb. She didn't rise to it. She'd been raised in a house where rising to things got you hurt, and she had a long patience in her that most people mistook for softness, right up until it turned out to be granite. It was Clara who broke it open. The little girl had been shadowing Sarah for days, not talking much, just there at her hip, at her elbow. A small, quiet presence that had started sleeping through the night, now that someone warm was in the house. And one afternoon, while Sarah kneaded bread, Clara said out of nowhere, in that small, clear child voice, "Eli cries at night. He thinks nobody hears him, but I hear him. He cries and says he's sorry." Sarah's hands went still in the dough. "Sorry for what, sweetheart?" "For the day Ma died. He was supposed to watch her medicine, and he forgot and went fishing, and she got worse, and then she died." Clara said it the way children say the most enormous things plainly, as if reporting weather. "Papa never said it was his fault. But Eli thinks it was his fault. He thinks if he'd stayed and given her the medicine, she wouldn't have died." Sarah stood very still with flour to her wrists. "Does your papa know Eli thinks that—" Clara shook her head. "Eli won't tell. He says if Papa knew, Papa would hate him too. Like—" She stopped. "Like what?" "Like Papa hates himself," Clara whispered, and then looked frightened at her own words, and grabbed her doll and ran. leaving Sarah alone in the kitchen, with her heart cracked wide open and everything suddenly terribly clear. The wall wasn't hate. She'd had it wrong for a week. Eli didn't hate her. Eli hated himself, and he'd built a fortress of meanness around a 10-year-old boy's conviction that he'd killed his own mother by going fishing. And every time she was kind, every time she made the house warm again, she was proving to him that he didn't deserve any of it, that a house could be happy without his mother in it, which to Eli meant his crime hadn't mattered, which was somehow worse than if it had. No wonder he wanted her gone. She was living proof that the family could heal. And healing was the one thing the boy couldn't allow, because if they healed, it meant Margaret was truly gone. And if Margaret was truly gone, then Eli had truly failed to save her, and there was no coming back from that. Sarah washed the flour off her hands very slowly. Then she went to find him. He was in the barn in the far stall hiding, and he heard her coming and hunched into himself like a fist. "Go away. No. I don't have to do anything you say. You're not my... I know I'm not your mother. Eli, we've been over that ground, it's flat. There's nothing left growing on it." She sat down on an overturned bucket a careful distance from him. Not close, never close, with a cornered thing. "I came to tell you something, and then I'll go, and you can throw water and open gates all you like. I don't care, but you're going to hear this first." He said nothing, but he didn't run. "It wasn't your fault." His whole body flinched. "The medicine, the fishing, your mother." Sarah kept her voice low and steady and merciless with kindness. "It wasn't your fault, Eli. I don't know what she had. I don't know if any medicine on this earth could have saved her, and neither do you because you're a boy, and you're not a doctor, and you couldn't have known. But even if you'd stayed home and given her every dose on the clock, sometimes people die anyway. Grown people who did everything right. It's the worst thing about being alive that you can do everything right and lose them anyway. Stop it. You was a little boy who went fishing. That's not a crime. That's a boy. Stop it." He was up, fists clenched. Tears streaming, 10 years old and destroyed. "You don't know. You don't know anything. I was supposed to watch her, and I left and she called for me, and I wasn't there, and she died calling for me, and it's my fault. It's my fault. It's my fault." And then, because there was nothing else left to break, he flung himself not away from her, but at her small body, slamming into her fists first, and then just fists, opening into a child's desperate grip, and Sarah caught him and held him while he came apart. She didn't shush him. She didn't tell him it was all right because it wasn't. Some things aren't. She just held on, held all his weight and all his grief, this furious wounded boy who'd been carrying a mountain no child should carry, and let him sob it into her shoulder until the barn went quiet, except for his hitching breath. "It wasn't your fault," she said again into his hair. "It wasn't your fault. It wasn't your fault." She said it maybe 100 times. She said it until he stopped fighting it. And somewhere in there, she felt the fortress come down, not gone, grief doesn't go, but down the walls of it collapsing, and what was underneath was just a little boy who missed his mother so much he'd almost died of it too. "I miss her," he wept. "I miss her every day, and everybody wants me to stop and I can't stop." "Then don't stop. Nobody's asking you to stop missing her. You'll miss her your whole life. That's not something to fix. That's just love with nowhere to go." She pulled back enough to look at him. "But you can put it somewhere, Eli. That's the thing nobody tells you. All that love, you can point it at the people still here, at Clara, at Rosie, at your papa who's drowning in case you hadn't noticed, drowning in the exact same water you are, and neither of you can see the other one going down. You could throw him a rope. You're the only one who can, because you're the only one who was there, the only one who loved her the way he did." Eli wiped his face with the back of his hand and looked at her with red, raw eyes and asked the question that undid her. "Are you going to tell him what I did?" "I'm going to tell him you're carrying something you shouldn't be," Sarah said. "But the rest, sorry, that's not mine to give away. That's yours to give to him when you're ready. And you should, soon, because he's got a sorry too. Eli, a great big one he thinks he can't ever set down. And I think maybe the only way either of you sets yours down is if you set them down together." He was quiet a long time. Then so quietly, she almost missed it. "You're not so bad." "High praise," Sarah said, and got the ghost of a wet laugh out of him. And that laugh was the second crack in everything, because the boy had been the hardest wall in the house, and she'd just walked through it, and the house would never be quite so cold again. She did tell Caleb. That night. After the children were down. She told him carefully, without breaking Clara's confidence more than she had to, that Eli believed himself responsible for Margaret's death, that he'd been carrying it alone for near a year, that the meanness was guilt wearing a costume. And she watched Caleb Ward's face collapse. He thinks he couldn't finish it. He sat down hard at the table. He was 10. He's a child. My God, he's been carrying that alone. All this. And then in a whisper that came from somewhere very deep. "How did I not see it? I'm his father. How did I not?" "Because you were drowning too," Sarah said gently. "That's not a slander, Ward. That's just true. You couldn't see him going under because you were under yourself. You've spent a year in that cold, and cold makes you selfish, not because you're a bad man, but because it takes everything you've got just to keep breathing. I know. I watched my mother go under, and I watched what it did to her, and she was the best woman I ever knew." Caleb put his face in his hands. "I have to talk to him," he said muffled. "I have to tell him it's not—" "You do, but not with the speech." Sarah sat across from him. "He doesn't need to hear it's not his fault, Ward. He's heard that everybody's told him that. He needs to hear you're sorry, the one you're carrying, because he thinks he's the only one who failed her. He doesn't know his father's been walking around a year thinking the exact same thing about himself." She watched him go still. "You are, aren't you? Thinking it was your fault?" The silence stretched. "I was in Miles City," Caleb said very low to his own hands. "Selling cattle. She took sick fast and I was 3 days off, and by the time the rider found me and I got home she was—" His voice broke clean in half. "I wasn't there. I was chasing a better price on beef and my wife died in that bed calling for me and I wasn't there. So don't tell me it wasn't my fault. I know that road. I know it's not my fault. And I've believed that road was my fault every single day for 11 months, and I don't know how to stop." And there it was. The whole rotten heart of the house laid open on the kitchen table. A father and a son, each convinced he'd killed the woman they both loved, each hiding it from the other, each so buried in private guilt that they'd let the whole family go cold rather than risk the other one seeing the crime they were sure they'd committed. Sarah reached across the table. She'd never touched him before. They'd shaken hands once over terms, and nothing since. But she put her hand over his scarred one now. "Then you and your boy have the exact same wound," she said. "And you're both bleeding in separate rooms. And I think God or fate or my no-good father put me in this house for one reason above all others, Ward, and it wasn't to cook. It was to walk in here from the outside and see what neither of you could see from inside the grief. You didn't kill her. Neither did Eli. She got sick and she died the way people do, the way my mother did, the way everybody's does eventually, and the two of you have spent a year punishing yourselves for a crime that was never committed, and those 2 little girls have paid the price for it, and it stops. It stops now. You hear me? It stops." He was crying. This hard, closed-off man was crying at his own kitchen table, and he didn't pull his hand away. "How?" he said. "How does it stop?" "You go up those stairs," Sarah said, "and you wake your son, and you tell him what you just told me. All of it. Miles City, the cattle, the sorry. You let him see that his father failed her too in his own mind, and that his father's still here, still standing, still worth loving. You show him a man can carry that, and not be a monster. Because right now, he thinks carrying it makes him a monster, and the only way he learns different is watching you carry yours out in the open." Caleb looked at the stairs. "I'm afraid," he said. It might have been the most honest thing he'd ever said to anyone. "I'm afraid if I open that up, I've held it shut so long I don't know what happens if I let it." "You cry," Sarah said. "That's what happens. You cry, and your boy cries, and you hold each other, and in the morning you're both still alive and a little lighter. That's all. That's the whole terrible secret. It doesn't kill you. It just feels like it will." She squeezed his hand once and let go. "Go on. I'll be down here. I'll keep the fire up." He stood. He crossed to the stairs. And at the bottom he stopped and turned back and looked at this 18-year-old girl his money had bought sitting at his wife's table like she'd always been there, and something crossed his face that she couldn't read and wouldn't understand until much later. "Margaret would have liked you," he said, and went up. Sarah sat alone in the kitchen and kept the fire up, and after a while she heard faintly through the floorboards the sound of a man and a boy weeping together in the dark. And it was the most terrible and the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard, and she put her own face in her hands at last. And this time, the first time since she'd come to this cold country, she let herself cry too. That was the third crack, and the biggest. The house had 2 ghosts in it, Margaret, and the guilt her men carried, and Sarah had just started to bury the second one at last. Things were different after that, not fixed. Nothing's fixed that fast, and Sarah didn't trust anything that healed clean. But Eli came down to breakfast the next morning and sat next to her instead of across. And he didn't say anything about it, and neither did she. And when she poured his milk, he mumbled, "Thank you," without being told, and that was worth more than a speech. And Caleb. Caleb was quieter, but a different quiet. A man setting down a weight and not yet trusting his legs without it. He looked at his children now, really looked. He'd been passing them like furniture for a year, and now he saw them and it made him clumsy out of practice. But he tried, and the trying was everything. The house warmed. Actually warmed. Sarah opened up rooms that had been shut-aired, the killing stillness out of them. Put bread and coffee and children's noise back into a place that had been holding its breath for a year. She still didn't go in Margaret's room. She'd given her word. But she noticed 3 weeks on that the door had been opened, from the inside. That Caleb had gone in one evening and stayed a long while and come out with red eyes and something eased in his shoulders, and that after that, the door stood cracked instead of sealed, and Clara took to going in sometimes, to sit on her mother's bed and talk to her out loud, the way you'd talk to someone in the next room, and nobody stopped her. It was becoming a home again, which is exactly when Thornton stopped being patient. It started with the water. Callahan came to the house at a dead run one morning. An old man doesn't run unless it's bad, and Sarah met him at the door with flour on her hands and knew before he spoke. "The spring," he gasped. "The north spring that feeds the whole east pasture, somebody's fouled it. Dumped something in it. Something dead and something worse, and there's 40 head watered off it already, and they're down, Mrs. Ward, they're down and frothing, and I've never seen the like." Caleb was there in an instant pulling on his coat. "How many can we save?" "I don't know. We gotta move the rest off that water now, or we lose the whole east herd." And then they were gone, all the men riding hard, and Sarah stood in the doorway with the children behind her and watched her new warm world tilt sideways. They lost 11 head, could have been 40. Callahan's quick eye saved the rest, but 11 prime cattle died frothing in the east pasture poisoned, and there was no lightning to blame, and no sickness in the herd, and nothing natural about it at all. Caleb came back at dusk with his sleeves black to the elbow and murder in his face. It was them, he said. He didn't have to say who. There was a wagon track, fresh, coming off the county road and going right to the spring and back. They drove out here in the night, and they poisoned my water, and they killed my cattle, and they want me to know it was them. That's why they didn't hide the track. They want me to know. It's a message." "What's the message?" Sarah said quietly. "Sell or it gets worse." He hung his hat. His hands were shaking not with fear, with rage. "This is how they do it. Callahan told you. Little things, and then bigger things. Fences, then water, then—" He stopped. "Then fire." Sarah finished. "The Peterson hay. That's the next step, isn't it? That's how they broke the Petersons." He didn't answer, which was an answer. Sarah sat down slowly. She thought about the cottonwood on the rise, and Margaret under it, and Thornton's cattle grazing over her bones. She thought about Eli, who'd finally started to sleep, and Clara talking to her mother through a cracked door, and Rosie, who'd learned to laugh this month for the first time anyone could remember. She thought about the word Caleb had made her say, plain 4 days into this marriage. What I build here is mine. And she thought about how she'd meant it all the way down. Then we don't wait for the fire, she said. Caleb looked at her. You said it yourself. Little things, bigger things. They've done fences to your neighbors and water to you. And fire's next on the list. And everybody in this valley knows the pattern, and every family that saw it coming sold out and ran. You're the last one. So they figure you'll break like the rest. A little pressure, a little more. And one morning you take the money and go. She stood, and there was that new thing in her voice again, the low, hard, certain thing. But we know what's coming. That's the one thing those other families didn't have going for them. They got surprised. We're not surprised. We know. And a thing you see coming is a thing you can get ready for. Sarah, how much do you know about Thornton? She pressed. The company. Not the men who poison springs, the men who pay them. Who owns it? Where's the money from? Who signs the papers? Because a company that big, buying up a whole valley one family at a time, always polite until it isn't. That's not a couple of cattlemen wanting more grass ward. That's a plan. Somebody's got a reason to want this exact valley, all of it, and if we knew the reason, we'd know the weakness, because every plan's got a weakness, and every crooked man's got a paper trail he'd rather nobody read. Caleb stared at her like he'd never seen her before. You want to fight them. I want to beat them, Sarah said. Fighting's what the Petersons did, swung back, got scared, gave up. I don't want to fight. I want to find out what they're hiding, because men who poison springs in the dark and drive their tracks in plain to send a message, those are men with something to protect, something they can't afford to have looked at too close. And I want to look at it. I want to look at it until it comes apart. She met his eyes. You've been trying to hold this land like a wall ward. Just stand there and take it and not fall down. But you can't win standing still against people who get to keep hitting. Sooner or later a wall comes down. We don't need a wall. We need to find the thing that makes them come down. The kitchen was silent. And then Caleb Ward did something he hadn't done in a year, maybe longer. He laughed one short, disbelieving breath of a laugh at the girl standing in his kitchen with flour on her hands, laying out a campaign against the most powerful company in the territory, like she was planning a supper. My father sold me to you for a note on the south field, Sarah said, and she wasn't smiling. He thought he was getting rid of a burden. I think he had no idea what he was handing you, and neither did you. But you're about to find out because Thornton just killed 11 head of your cattle to scare you into running, and instead, they've gone and put me on the far side of angry, and I don't run ward. My whole life people have counted on me running, and I have never once done it. Ask my father. Oh, you can't. He's the one who found out I don't break. She untied her apron. Now, tell me everything you know about Thornton. Start at the beginning. Leave nothing out. We've got work to do, and I'd say we've got till spring before the fire comes, so we'd best not waste it. Caleb looked at her a long moment. Then he pulled out a chair and sat and started to talk. He talked late into the night. He told her Thornton had come into the territory 4 years back, buying the old Chandler place, first paying too much for it, which everyone had thought was foolish at the time. He told her they'd bought up the low ground along the river, next the poorest grazing in the valley, the parcels nobody wanted, which had made no sense to anyone because you don't pay top dollar for bad grass. He told her they'd got a man in the county land office, a clerk named Pruitt. Everybody knew Pruitt was in their pocket. He told her the families who'd sold had all signed papers he'd never seen and gone away quiet, and a couple of them he'd tried to write to afterward and never heard back. And Sarah listened and turned it over, and somewhere past midnight she said the thing that changed the whole shape of it. Why the river ground? What? You said they bought the poorest grazing first. The low ground along the river. Paid too much for bad grass. Why? She leaned forward. Nobody pays top dollar for bad grass, Ward. You don't. I don't. Nobody does. Unless the grass isn't what they're buying. Unless there's something about that river ground that's worth money for a reason that's got nothing to do with cattle. Her eyes had gone bright and hard. What runs through the low ground? The river, the mussel shell. And where does everybody's water come from? Caleb went very still. "The river," he said slowly. "It all comes off the river. Every spring, every creek in this valley, it's all fed off the—" He stopped. His face changed. "If somebody owned the river ground, both banks, all of it, top to bottom, they'd own the water," Sarah breathed. "Every drop in the valley. And a man who owns the water owns every ranch that drinks from it, whether they sold him their land or not. He wouldn't need to buy your grass ward. He'd just need to buy the water above you, and then one dry summer he dams it or fouls it or charges you for it. And you either pay whatever he asks, or you watch your herd die of thirst on land you own free and clear." The lamp guttered between them. "That's the plan," Caleb said hoarse. "That's the whole. They're not buying a valley. They're buying a chokehold. And I'm the last big holding that sits between them and the headwaters, so if they get my land—" "They own the top of the river," Sarah finished. "And everybody below you is finished whether they've sold or not. It was never about your grass. It was never even really about you. You're just the last lock on a door they've been picking open for 4 years." She sat back, and her heart was pounding, and for the first time she felt not just angry, but afraid, because this was bigger than a company bullying a widower. This was a scheme to strangle a whole valley, and they'd figured it out, the two of them, at a kitchen table at midnight. And now they knew, and knowing a thing like that was its own kind of danger. Because there was one question left, and she was almost afraid to ask it, and she asked it anyway. "Ward, who owns Thornton, the actual man? The one whose name is on the top of that letter. Do you know?" "No," he said. "Nobody does. It's a company. There's agents and lawyers and that clerk Pruitt. But the man himself, nobody's ever seen him. He doesn't come to the valley. He signs from somewhere back east, they say, or a knock at the door. At midnight. In the dead of a Montana winter. A knock." The whole house seemed to stop breathing. Caleb rose slow, and his hand went to the shelf by the door where the rifle stood, and Sarah stood too, and neither of them made a sound as the knock came again. 3 slow, deliberate raps unhurried the knock of someone who had all the time in the world. Caleb opened the door with the rifle low against his leg. A man stood on the porch in a good black coat hat in his gloved hands, a stranger smiling a soft, prosperous smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Mr. Ward," the stranger said pleasantly, "forgive the hour. I'd have come sooner, but the roads, you know. The roads out here are a trial." He looked past Caleb into the warm, bright kitchen, and his gaze found Sarah and lingered on her a beat too long, and something in that look made her skin crawl. "And this must be the new Mrs. Ward. I'd heard the widower took a wife. Congratulations are in order." The smile widened. "My name is Thornton. I believe you've been receiving my letters." Nobody spoke. Then Caleb said without moving from the doorway, "You've got some nerve coming to my house at midnight after killing my cattle this morning." "Cattle!" Thornton's brow creased with a concern so smooth it was almost art. "I heard you'd lost some stock. A shame. This is hard country, Mr. Ward. Bad water disease wolves, a man can lose a whole herd and never know the cause. It's why I've always said a wise man takes a fair price and moves somewhere gentler while he still can." The soft smile again. "May I come in? It's bitter out here, and I think what I have to say is better said sitting down." "You can say it on the porch, Caleb." Sarah put her hand on his arm. She'd made a decision in the space of 3 seconds, the way she made all her decisions fast and then all the way. "Let him in." Both men looked at her. "Let him in," she said, again quiet. "He drove out here in the middle of a winter night. A man doesn't do that unless he wants something bad enough to sit at your table for it. And I'd rather know what a snake wants than guess at it." She met Thornton's pale, amused eyes. "Come in, Mr. Thornton. I'll put coffee on. You'll want to be warm for whatever you came to say." Something flickered across Thornton's face. Surprise maybe, or reassessment. He'd come expecting a broken widower and a frightened girl, and here was the girl inviting him in, like she was the one holding the cards. He stepped inside, and Caleb shut the door behind him, and Sarah went to the stove and put the coffee on with her back to both of them, and her hands did not shake, and she was proud of that. You've a lovely home, Thornton said, settling into a chair uninvited, taking in the warm kitchen, the children's things, the life of the place. Warmer than I expected. I'd heard the household had rather fallen apart after the first Mrs. Ward passed. He let that sit. But I see it's been revived. New wife, new warmth. Almost a pity. Why a pity? Sarah said, not turning around. Because it makes what's coming so much harder to bear. He said it gently, regretfully, a man delivering weather. Mrs. Ward, I'll be plain with you since your husband won't sit, and your household's clearly the sort where the wife has a say unusual out here, but I don't object. I've made your husband a generous offer. More than generous. More than this land is worth by any honest measure. And he's refused it out of sentiment. I understand the first Mrs. Ward is buried here. I respect that. I'm not a monster. 11 head of my cattle died frothing this morning, Caleb said. Poisoned. There's a wagon track leads from the county road to my spring and back. How dreadful. Thornton didn't blink. You should report it to the sheriff, though I'd not expect much. Sheriff Boggs is a busy man, and a wagon track's a thin thing to hang a case on, and out here a spring goes bad for 100 reasons. He turned back to Sarah, dismissing Caleb entirely, and that was a mistake, though he didn't know it yet. The offer, Mrs. Ward. Let me put it to you since you strike me as a practical woman. Your husband is land poor and grief heavy. He's holding this ground out of loyalty to a dead woman, and loyalty's a fine thing, but it doesn't feed children, and I count 3 of them under this roof, don't I? And a 4th on the way soon enough, I'd imagine, young as you are. Sarah set a cup of coffee in front of him, carefully, politely. Go on, take the money. Thornton wrapped his gloved hands around the cup. Take it and go somewhere kind. California, Oregon. Buy a house in a town with a school and a doctor and a church. Raise those children soft and safe, and let this hard, cold valley go to a man who has plans for it. You're 18 years old, Mrs. Ward. You've a whole life ahead. Why spend it fighting a war you'll lose over grass for a man's dead first wife? His voice dropped intimate, poisonous. I'll even sweeten it. I'll put an extra sum aside for you. In your name. Separate from your husband's. A woman ought to have something of her own, don't you think? Something no man can take from her. Call it a gift from one practical person to another. The kitchen went very still. Caleb's face had gone white. He understood what he'd just heard: Thornton offering his wife money behind his back, offering to buy her separate to make her a partner, in surrendering everything Caleb had. And Sarah understood it too, and she understood the deeper cruelty of it, which was that Thornton had reached into the exact wound she carried. A woman ought to have something of her own, something no man can take from her, and used her own deepest wish as bait. He'd done his homework. He knew she'd been sold. He knew what a girl who'd been sold wanted more than anything on earth. He just didn't know her. Sarah pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, folded her hands on the table, and looked at Silas Thornton with a calm that made Caleb's breath catch. That's a fine offer, she said. Money in my own name. Nobody can take it from me. A house in a soft town. My own something at last. She tilted her head. You looked into me before you came. You know my father sold me off a porch 4 days from here to a man I'd never met for a note on a field. You know I've never in my life owned a thing that somebody else couldn't take away with a signature. And you came here tonight and you dangled the one thing I've wanted since I was a girl, something mine, right in front of my face. Because you figured a person who's been traded like a debt would sell out anybody to finally stop being poor and powerless. She smiled, and it was not a warm smile. That's real careful work, Mr. Thornton. That's a man who studies people so he can find the soft place and push. I'll bet it's worked on every family in this valley. Thornton's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes sharpened. But you made one mistake. Sarah went on, easy, almost kind. You figured because I want something of my own, I'd take it from anybody's hand. And I won't. Because I already found something that's mine, Mr. Thornton. And it wasn't money, and nobody gave it to me. I built it with these 2 hands in 3 weeks out of a cold house full of grieving children. This kitchen's mine. That boy upstairs who finally sleeps at night, he's mine now. The warm in this house that you called a pity, I made that. And it's the first thing I've ever owned in my life that a signature can't take, and you want me to trade it to you for a house in California." She laughed short and hard. "You've got nothing I want. You never did. You just didn't know it because you looked at my whole life and saw a price tag, same as my father did, same as everybody's always done." And I'll tell you what I told him 4 days back on that porch, right before he drove off and left me. She leaned in. "I won't stay bought." The silence rang. Thornton set down his coffee untouched. "You're making a mistake," he said, and the gentleness had drained clean out of his voice now, and what was under it was cold and flat and very old. "Both of you. I came here as a courtesy. I came to offer you a way out with your dignity and your children whole. Because I'll have this land, Mr. Ward, one way or another. By spring I'll have it. The only choice you're making tonight is how. Rich and gone, or—" He stood and pulled on his gloves finger by finger. "There are hard winters coming. Water goes bad. Barns burn. Accidents happen to men who work with dangerous stock in cold weather. And a widow, a second widow with 3 children, and no husband. And a ranch she can't run alone. She signs whatever's put in front of her. They always do." He set his hat on his head. "I do hope it doesn't come to that, Mrs. Ward. I've rather enjoyed meeting you. You're wasted here." Caleb moved before Sarah could stop him, crossed the kitchen in 2 strides, and had a fistful of Thornton's fine black coat and slammed him back against the door hard enough to rattle the frame. "You threaten my family in my own house," he said low and shaking. "You come to my table and threaten my wife." "Caleb." Sarah was on her feet. "Caleb, let him go." "I'll bury you." Caleb breathed into Thornton's face. "I swear before God, you come near my children, you touch one hair." Caleb let him go. This is what he wants. Because it was. She saw it clear as day. Thornton hadn't flinched, hadn't struggled, was just hanging there in Caleb's grip with that faint, amused patience. And she understood he'd come to provoke exactly this, a man assaulting him, maybe a witness, maybe a charge, some thread to pull. He wanted Caleb to swing. Caleb heard her. Barely. His grip loosened by degrees, and he stepped back, chest heaving, and Thornton smoothed his coat with 2 gloved hands. Unhurried, and it was that unhurriedness that was the most frightening thing about him. A man being manhandled who was not afraid because he knew he held every card that mattered. "Your wife's the smart one," Thornton observed, opening the door to the cold. "You do well to listen to her. She sees the board clearer than you do." He stepped out onto the porch and turned, and his eyes went to Sarah one last time, and that lingering ownership in his gaze made her want to bathe. "Spring, Mrs. Ward. I'm a patient man, but I'm not a saint. You've got till the ground thaws to be reasonable. After that—" He shrugged, almost apologetic. "After that, it stops being up to me. Good night. Thank you for the coffee. You brew it strong. I like that in a woman." And he was gone down the steps and into the dark. And a moment later, they heard a buggy pull away. He'd had a driver waiting the whole time out in the killing cold, which told Sarah everything about the kind of man he was. Caleb shut the door and bolted it, and stood with his forehead against the wood, breathing hard. "I'm sorry," he said. "I lost my—" "He threatened you. He stood in my house and threatened you and the children, and I couldn't. You did fine." Sarah's own hands were shaking now, finally, now that it was over. "You let him go. That's the thing that mattered. He wanted you to hit him, Caleb. He was hanging there begging for it. A man who owns the sheriff and the land clerk wants nothing better than a witness who'll swear Caleb Ward attacked him unprovoked. You didn't give it to him. That's not weakness. That's the smartest thing you did all night." Caleb turned around. His eyes were wet and furious. "He offered you money, behind my back, to sell us out." "He did. And you—" "I told him to go to hell with a bow on it," Sarah said. "Weren't you listening?" And then, because he was still standing there raw and disbelieving, she crossed the kitchen and took his face in both her hands, the first time she'd ever touched him so, and it stopped his breath and made him look at her. "Hear me, Caleb Ward. I am not for sale. Not to my father, not to you, not to Silas Thornton, not to anybody with a checkbook and a soft voice. That man looked at me and saw a thing that could be bought because I'd been sold once. He's wrong. Getting sold didn't teach me I have a price. It taught me I'd rather die than ever have one again. Do you understand me? Caleb looked at her for a long moment. I understand you, he said hoarsely. Then we're going to beat him, Sarah said, and let go of his face and stepped back, and the moment closed, but something in it stayed. Because now I've met him, and I know his kind, and I'll tell you what I learned tonight worth more than anything else. He's afraid. Afraid? That man's not afraid of anything. He's afraid of time, Sarah said. Didn't you hear him spring till the ground thaws? He's got a clock on him, Caleb. He kept coming back to it, spring patient, but not a saint. A man who truly held all the cards would take his time, squeeze slow. Wait, you out over years. Thornton can't. Something's got him on a schedule, something we don't know about yet, and that's the weakness, that's the thread. Whatever this river scheme is, he needs it done by spring, or it costs him, and a man on a clock makes mistakes. She was already moving, already pacing her mind 3 steps ahead. We've got till the thaw. He said so himself. He thinks that's his deadline to break us. But it's our deadline too to find out what he's hiding before he can finish it. And I mean to use every day of it. She started the next morning. She'd realized lying awake half the night that they'd been thinking too small, poking at fences and springs, and the local men Thornton had bought. But the answer wasn't in the valley. It was in whatever put Thornton on a clock, and that meant it was written down somewhere in a land office, or a courthouse, or a lawyer's file, because schemes this big always came down to paper in the end. Caleb had said it himself weeks ago, and not known how right he was. Every crooked man's got a paper trail he'd rather nobody read. I need to go to town, she told Caleb over breakfast. Twin Forks, the county seat. For what? To read? She buttered Clara's bread without looking up. You said there's a clerk at the land office, Pruitt, that's in Thornton's pocket. Fine. But a land office isn't just the clerk. It's the records, every deed, every sale, every water claim filed in this county. And by law, they're public, anybody can walk in and ask to see them. Pruitt can be crooked all he likes, he can't hide a whole book of public record. Not if somebody knows what she's looking for and won't leave till she finds it. Caleb set down his fork. Pruitt won't show you anything. He'll say the books are being audited, or the clerk's out, or... Then I'll be very patient and very polite and very hard to get rid of, Sarah said. And I'll go back the next day and the next until he's more scared of the fuss I'll make than of whatever Thornton pays him. I ran my father's dealings with every creditor and merchant from the time I was 12, Caleb. I have made grown men in ledger rooms wish they'd never been born, all while smiling and calling them sir. Pruitt has no idea what's about to walk through his door. Eli, who'd been listening with his spoon halfway to his mouth, said suddenly, Can I come? No, said Caleb. I know the town. I know where the land office is. I know Mr. Pruitt. I could... You've got school and chores and you're staying home, Caleb said, but not harshly. And Sarah caught the flicker of something new between them, a father and son who'd wept together in the dark 3 weeks back, and were still learning how to be easy with each other in the daylight. Eli scowled, but let it go, and that letting go was its own small victory. I'll take Callahan, Sarah said. If Thornton's got men watching the roads, I'd rather not ride alone. And Callahan's got a memory like a courthouse himself. He's been in this valley 11 years. He'll know every name in those books. Caleb was quiet a moment. You really think it's in the records? He said. Whatever he's hiding. I think a man doesn't spend 4 years and a fortune buying bad river ground, unless there's a reason. And I think the reason's on file somewhere, because it has to be you can't own water without claiming it, and you can't claim it without paper, and paper doesn't lie the way men do. She stood and gathered plates. I think Silas Thornton built a machine to strangle this whole valley, and it's a beautiful machine and it's nearly finished. But every machine's got a bolt somewhere that if you find it and pull it, the whole thing comes to pieces. I'm going to town to find the bolt. Shampoo. Twin Forks was a day's hard ride, and they left before dawn. Callahan rode beside her the whole way, watchful, his rifle across his saddle, and twice she saw him mark riders in the distance and change their route, and neither of them said anything about it. But she understood they were being followed or watched, and the understanding sat cold in her chest the whole journey. The whole. The land office was a squat building off the main street, and the clerk Pruitt was a soft, damp man with ink-stained fingers and eyes that jumped when she said the name Ward. "Records are being audited," he said before she'd even finished asking. "Can't let anybody in the books just now. County order. Come back in the spring." Spring. There it was again. The whole county seemed to be holding its breath till spring. "That's a shame," Sarah said pleasantly, and pulled a chair over to the counter and sat down and folded her hands and settled in like a woman who'd brought her knitting. "I'll wait then." "You can't, ma'am. You can't wait here. The books are closed." "Oh, I'm not waiting for the books. I'm waiting for you to change your mind." She smiled at him. "See, Mr. Pruitt, the law says these records are public. Every deed, every claim open to any citizen who asks. You know that I know that, and if I have to, I'll ride to the territorial capital and say to a judge that a county clerk turned away a lawful citizen from public records he's paid to keep, and then somebody's going to come audit you, Mr. Pruitt, and I don't think a man audits as clean as you'd like." She let that land. "Or you could just let me read the water claims filed along the Muscle Shell these last 4 years. That's all I want. Public record. 10 minutes. And I'll never trouble you again, and nobody ever has to know you were the one who showed me." Pruitt had gone the color of old cheese. "I don't know what you mean," he said. "Water claims. There's nothing." "Then it won't hurt to let me look, will it?" Sarah kept smiling. "Because if there's nothing there, I read for 10 minutes and go home and stop bothering you. But if you keep me from looking well, that tells me there's something worth keeping me from. And then I get very interested, Mr. Pruitt, and I've been told my interest is a hard thing to shake off." She leaned in confidingly. "Mr. Thornton pays you, doesn't he? I won't make you say it. But think on this, Thornton pays you to keep these books shut. What happens to you when Thornton's scheme comes apart and it's going to Mr. Pruitt? I promise you it is, and there's a crooked clerk left holding all the crooked papers with his name on the register. He rides off back east. You go to prison. You're not the man he's protecting. You're the man he's using, and men like Thornton throw away the used ones first." The clerk's hands had started to tremble, and Sarah knew in that instant watching him that she'd found a soft place of her own to push, that Pruitt was a small, frightened man who'd taken Thornton's money and lain awake ever since, knowing exactly how it would end for him. She didn't gloat. She just waited and let his own fear do the work the way Thornton had tried to let hers do his. "If I show you," Pruitt whispered, glancing at the door. "If anyone knew, No one will know. Callahan and I rode in quiet and we'll ride out quiet. You show me the claims, and whatever happens after, you were never anything but a clerk who followed the law and let a citizen see public record. That's your protection, Mr. Pruitt. Not Thornton's money, the law. Get on the right side of it now while you still can, before it's the only thing left standing between you and a cell." For a long moment the clerk didn't move. Then with shaking hands, he went to a shelf behind the counter and pulled down a heavy ledger and set it on the counter and opened it to a page near the back and turned it around to face her. "The water claims," he said, barely audible. "Muscle Shell River, filed by Thornton Land and Cattle. God help me. God help us all." Sarah bent over the book, and what she read there made her blood run cold, because it was worse than she'd guessed. Thornton hadn't just been buying riverland. He'd been filing water rights, one narrow parcel at a time, claim after claim, all up and down the Muscle Shell and under the territory's law. Whoever held the earliest continuous claim to the water held it against all comers downstream. He'd been assembling the rights to the entire river, and the claims were nearly complete. There was a whole chain of them running from the headwaters down, and only one gap left in the chain, one stretch of riverbank not yet claimed, and that stretch ran through Ward land. "That's why it's you," she breathed. "That's why you're last. You're not just the last big ranch, your land's the last gap. He's got the whole river claimed except the piece that runs through your ground, and until he owns it or claims it, his chain's broken, and a broken chain's worth nothing. That's his clock. That's why spring." Pruitt swallowed. "There's a deadline. On the claims. Territorial law, the water rights he's filed, They lapse if the chain's not made continuous and proved up before the annual filing closes. And that closes when? Sarah's heart was pounding. First day of spring court session. If he doesn't hold an unbroken claim down the whole river by then, the earliest ones expire and the whole chain unravels and 4 years and a fortune wash straight down the muscle shell. Pruitt's voice cracked. That's why he's desperate for the ward land. Not greedy. Desperate. He's got everything sunk into this, and it all falls apart if he can't close that gap by spring court. He'll do anything. He'll do anything, Mrs. Ward, do you understand? A man with that much to lose on a clock like that. And that was when the door of the land office banged open behind her, and a voice she didn't know said, "Well now, what have we here?" Sarah turned. A man stood in the doorway with a star on his coat and a hard, flat face. Sheriff Boggs. She'd have bet her life on it the busy Sheriff Thornton had mentioned so pointedly. And behind him, 2 more men with the look of hired trouble, and Pruitt had gone white as death and was already stammering. "Sheriff, she made me, I never—" "That's public record I'm reading, Sheriff," Sarah said, and thank God her voice came out steady. "Lawful and open. There's no crime in a citizen reading a county ledger." "No." Boggs agreed, ambling and thumbs in his belt. "No crime in that, but there's a crime in horse theft, and it happens. I got a report this very morning of a bay gelding stolen off a spread out east. And wouldn't you know it, ma'am, the horse your man Callahan's got tied up outside. Answers the description to the letter." He smiled, and it was Thornton's smile learned, or bought, or both. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to hold the both of you. Just till we sort it out. Could take a while. Roads being what they are." He glanced at the ledger open on the counter, and his smile widened. "Long while, maybe. Now why don't you shut that book and come along quiet, and we'll get this all straightened out. Mr. Thornton'll be so relieved to hear you're safe." Callahan's hand had drifted toward his rifle, and Sarah caught his eye and gave the smallest shake of her head, because there were 3 of them, and a wall at her back, and a boy at home who'd finally learned to sleep, and because she understood cold and clear that Thornton had known she'd come here, had let her come, had let her read the whole terrible truth, because it didn't matter what she knew if she was sitting in his sheriff's jail when spring court opened and the ward land fell into his hand. She'd found the bolt that would bring the machine to pieces, and she'd walked straight into a trap to do it. Sarah shut the book. She did it slowly, deliberately, and while her hands moved, she was thinking faster than she'd ever thought in her life, because Boggs had made one mistake, the same mistake Thornton made, the mistake every one of these men made looking at a young woman. He thought she'd panic. "Horse theft," she said, straightening. "That's a serious charge, Sheriff. A hanging charge some places. You must be very sure of it to arrest a rancher's wife and her foreman in front of the county clerk." "Sure enough. Then you'll have the report, the written complaint, the name of the man whose bay gelding went missing, and the description he swore to, and the date he filed it." She kept her voice pleasant, a woman making conversation. "Because a sheriff doesn't arrest folks on a rumor, does he? That'd be false arrest. That'd be a thing a territorial judge takes a very dim view of, so you'll have the paper. Mr. Pruitt here keeps the county files. Why don't you have him pull the complaint right now so we can all see it's proper, and then I'll come along quiet as you please." Boggs's jaw tightened. There was no complaint. They both knew there was no complaint. He'd made it up on Thornton's word not an hour ago, and now she'd said the word paper in front of a clerk who kept the papers and Pruitt sweating. Terrified Pruitt, who'd just been told his whole future hung on getting right with the law before it was too late, was looking back and forth between them like a man watching 2 trains about to meet. "The complaint," Sarah said again, gently to Pruitt. "Is there one on file, Mr. Pruitt? A horse theft reported this morning? You'd know. You keep the register." She held his eyes. "The truth. On the record. In front of witnesses." The clerk's mouth worked. "Pruitt," Boggs said low and warning, and that was the moment Sarah saw it happen. Saw the small, frightened man make the biggest choice of his small, frightened life. Because Boggs's warning tone told Pruitt everything that the sheriff was in it too, that they were all in it together, and that when it came apart, they'd all go down together, and Pruitt was the smallest and the softest and the first they'd throw to the wolves. "There's no complaint," Pruitt whispered. "No horse was reported stolen. Not this morning. Not any morning this week." He was shaking, but he said it. "It's the truth. God forgive me, it's the truth, and I'm done lying for that man. I'm done." "You damned fool!" Boggs snarled, and his hand dropped to his gun. And Callahan's rifle came up level and cocked in the same breath, that bandy-legged old man moving quicker than any of them expected, and he said, mild as milk, "I wouldn't, Sheriff. I surely wouldn't. I've buried better men than you for less, and my hand don't shake." A pause. "Now everybody's going to breathe slow, and nobody's going to clear leather, and this nice lady's going to finish her business, because it turns out there ain't no horse thief here after all. Just a clerk with a conscience and a sheriff with a story that didn't hold." For 3 long seconds nobody moved. Then Boggs's hand came off his gun slow, and he smiled that hard, flat smile, and Sarah understood he was recalculating just like Thornton had, that these men were only ever brave with the odds stacked, and the odds had just shifted. "This isn't over," Boggs said. "No." Sarah agreed. "It surely isn't, but it's over for today." She turned to Pruitt, and her voice gentled entirely. "Mr. Pruitt, you just did a brave thing. The bravest thing in this room. And I'm going to see it's not the thing that ruins you." She pulled a fresh sheet of paper from the stack on his counter and pushed it toward him. "I need you to do one more brave thing. I need you to make me a true copy of those water claims every one Thornton filed on the mussel shell, and the filing dates and the lapse deadline. And I need you to sign it, and I need you to swear it's a true copy of the county record. And then I need you to make a second copy and keep it somewhere safe, somewhere not this office, because a book can burn, Mr. Pruitt, and men who poison springs aren't above burning a land office to keep what's in it from ever seeing a courtroom." Pruitt stared at her. "You want me to testify," he breathed, "against Thornton, in court. I want you to tell the truth," Sarah said. "In writing, and then someday out loud in front of a judge where it'll do some good. That's all. That's the whole of it. You've spent years being the man who helped him hide it. Be the man who helped bring it to light instead. It's not too late. It's the one thing in this whole rotten business that's still right now, this minute, not too late." She held his eyes. "You started when you told the truth about the horse. Don't stop now. Finish it." And the clerk, weeping openly, now dipped his pen and began to write. She rode home through the dark with the copy sewn inside her coat lining, and Callahan close beside her, and neither of them relaxed until the lamp of the ward house came up out of the black, and Caleb was on the porch waiting, had been waiting for hours by the look of him, and he came down the steps before her horse had stopped. "You're all right." His hands were on her waist, lifting her down before he thought about it, and then they both went still at the touch, and he stepped back. "Callahan sent a boy ahead. Said there was trouble," said Boggs. "I've been out of my mind. What happened? Are you hurt?" "I'm not hurt." She pressed her hand flat against her coat, against the paper hidden there, and felt her whole body start to shake now that it was safe to. "Caleb, I found it. The bolt. The whole thing." She looked up at him. "It's water. Just like we thought, but worse and better. He's filed claims on the entire mussel shell top to bottom, and there's only one gap left in the chain, and the gap is us. Our land. That's why it's always been us. And there's a deadline, a real one in the law his claims lapse, if the chain's not made whole and proved up before spring court opens. If we can hold our stretch of river past that date, his whole scheme washes away. 4 years of fortune gone. All we have to do is hold Caleb. Just hold our own ground till spring court. That's all. That's the whole war." Caleb stared at her. "That's why he said spring," he said slowly. "That's the clock. That's the clock. And I've got proof sworn, signed, a true copy of the county record, and the clerk who kept it turned tonight. Caleb, he turned, he'll testify. We don't just have to hold anymore. We can win. We can walk into that spring court and show the judge what Thornton's been doing to this whole valley. The claims the families run off the springs, the fire that wasn't lightning, and we can break him in the open in front of the law, where his sheriff and his clerk can't help him." Her voice was rising fierce and bright. "He's not the one with the clock over us anymore. We've got the clock over him. All we do is survive till spring and hold our ground, and he loses everything." For a moment, Caleb just looked at her. This girl, his money had bought standing in his yard in the dark with the salvation of everything he loved, sewn into her coat, and something moved across his face that she'd never seen there. Something that scared her more than Thornton had. "You could have run," he said quietly. "Today, in that office, when Boggs came in. You could have let Callahan pull his gun, or you could have broke and let them take you, or 100 things. Any sensible person would have been terrified." He shook his head slowly. "You sat there and made a crooked clerk turn honest and a crooked sheriff back down 18 years old, a day's ride from home with 3 men in a jail cell in front of you. Who are you, Sarah?" "I'm the girl your money bought," she said. "Remember, off a porch, for a note on a field." "No." His voice was rough. "No, you're not. You never were. My money bought a paper my father-in-law would have laughed at. It didn't buy you. Nobody's ever going to buy you." He took a step closer. "I've spent 3 weeks watching you put my house back together with your bare hands, and I told myself it was the arrangement. It was terms, it was you keeping your end of a bargain. And today, Callahan's boy came riding in, yelling that Boggs had you, and I got on a horse before I knew I'd moved, and I was halfway to Twin Forks in the dark before Callahan's second rider caught me and turned me back, and the whole way there I wasn't thinking about the land, Sarah. I wasn't thinking about the ranch or the water or Margaret or any of it. I was thinking if they hurt her, I'll burn that whole town to the ground." His breath came uneven. "That's not the arrangement. That's not terms. I didn't mean for this. I swore I'd never—" "Don't!" Sarah's heart was hammering. "Caleb, don't say a thing you'll want back. We're tired and we're scared and it was a hard day." "I'm not going to say it," he said. "You're right. Not now. Not tonight. Not with all this hanging over us. Not when you might mistake it for the fear talking. But I'm going to say it someday, Sarah, when this is over and won, and there's nothing hanging over us, and you can be sure I mean it clean. I'm just telling you now so you know it's coming, so you're not blindsided." He stepped back and gave her the ghost of a smile, the first real smile she'd ever seen on him. "Now come inside. Eli's been sitting up in the window since sundown waiting for you." He wouldn't say why, but he wouldn't go to bed either. And Sarah went inside and Eli flew off the window seat and across the room and threw his arms around her waist without a word. This boy who 3 weeks ago had told her she wasn't his mother, and she held him and looked over his head at Caleb standing in the doorway, watching them with his whole ruined heart in his eyes, and understood that somewhere between the porch where her father sold her and this cold Montana kitchen, she'd stopped being a thing that was traded and become a woman who was chosen, and that it had happened so quietly she'd almost missed it. "You came back," Eli mumbled into her apron. "I told you I don't run," Sarah said and smoothed his hair. "Now let go of me long enough for me to get my coat off, and I'll tell you and your papa exactly how we're going to save this ranch." They had 6 weeks till spring court. 6 weeks, and Thornton knew now that she knew Boggs would have ridden straight to him with the news that she'd read the claims and the clerk had turned. Which meant 6 weeks of a desperate man with everything to lose, and Sarah had told Caleb the plain truth of it that first night. The smart move for Thornton now wasn't to buy them out anymore. It was too late for buying. His clock was too short. The only thing that saved his scheme now was for the Ward land to change hands before spring court, and there was one way left to make a ranch change hands fast. If Caleb died, the land passed to his widow. And a young widow with 3 children and no husband, run off her feet and terrified alone, against the whole weight of Thornton's money and Thornton's sheriff she'd sign. Thornton had said it himself that first midnight. They always do. "So he's going to try to kill you," Sarah said. "That's what's left. That's the only card he's got that beats our clock. He'll make it look like an accident, a fall, a spooked horse, a barn." She'd gone cold saying it, but she said it because a thing you name is a thing you can guard against. Which means from now until spring court, you don't ride alone, you don't work alone, you're never anywhere a man could get to you quiet, and neither am I, and neither are the children. We stay close, and we stay watchful, and we hold on, and we do not give that man one single opening. 6 weeks. We just have to get through 6 weeks. They almost made it. They made it 5. It came in the end the way she'd feared it would from the very first with fire. It was near midnight, and a hand named Dutch was on watch, and the first anyone knew was Dutch's voice screaming up from the yard. Fire, fire, the barn's afire, and Caleb was up and down the stairs and out the door before Sarah had her boots on, and by the time she got to the porch, the whole night was orange, and the horse barn was going up like a torch, and she could hear the animals inside screaming that terrible, almost human sound of penned things burning. The stock. Caleb was already running. Get the stock out, Dutch. The far doors, get the far doors. It was arson. There was no question and no pretending otherwise. The fire had started in 3 places at once, the way no accident starts, and there was a smell of coal oil under the smoke, and Sarah understood in one sick heartbeat that this was it. This was Thornton's play, and it wasn't really about the barn at all. It was about getting Caleb to run into it. "Caleb, wait!" she screamed, but he was already at the doors, already hauling them open, already plunging into the smoke after his horses, and Callahan was right behind him, and the two of them vanished into the roaring orange, and Sarah stood frozen for one endless second, understanding that somewhere in that burning barn, or waiting just beyond it, was whatever Thornton had sent. Because you don't just burn a man's barn, you burn it to flush him out into the dark, where a shot goes unheard, under the noise of the fire, or a falling beam looks like bad luck, or she ran. Not away. Toward the barn. Toward the fire. Toward the man she'd shaken hands with over terms, and somewhere along the way started to love without ever deciding to. She ran into the smoke, calling his name, and the heat hit her like a wall, and the smoke tore at her lungs, and she could see almost nothing. Just shapes in the orange murk, panicked horses and men hauling at them, and beams overhead already glowing. Caleb. "Sarah, get out!" His voice off to the left, hoarse with smoke. "Get out of here! Are you mad?" "Not without you." She fought toward the sound of him tripping over her own skirts, and found him hauling on a terrified mare's halter, and she got her hands on the rope too, and together they dragged the animal toward the doors. And that was when she saw it, up in the loft, through the smoke, a shape that wasn't a beam and wasn't a horse. A man. A man with a rifle crouched in the burning loft waiting, and the fire hadn't been to flush Caleb into the dark at all. The shooter had been inside the whole time, and Caleb had run straight in under him, and the man was raising the rifle, now taking aim at the back of Caleb's head, not 15 feet away, close enough that even through the smoke he couldn't miss. Caleb down, she didn't think. There was no thought in it. She let go of the rope and threw herself at him. Both hands, all her weight slammed into him and drove him sideways and down. Just as the rifle cracked, she felt the shot go past, felt the wind of it, heard it bury itself in the beam where his head had been, and they went down together in the burning straw as a section of the loft weakened by the fire groaned and gave way, and the shooter's platform collapsed under him and dropped him screaming into the flames, rifle and all, and a burning beam came down with him. Sarah saw it coming, and there was no time at all, and Caleb saw it too, and did the only thing there was to do. He twisted and got his body over hers and took it. The beam caught him across the back and shoulders and drove them both flat into the straw, and she heard him make a sound she'd never heard a man make. And then he was pinned, and the fire was everywhere, and she was screaming his name and shoving at the beam that had him, and it wouldn't move. It wouldn't move. Callahan, Callahan, he's pinned. And then there were hands, many hands, Callahan and Dutch, and 2 more of the winter hands and Eli. God. Eli. The boy had run out of the house and into the burning barn after his father, 10 years old, and got his small shoulder under the beam with the grown men. And together they heaved it up just enough, just barely enough, and Sarah dragged Caleb out from under it by his arms, while the whole loft came down behind them in a roar of sparks, and they fell together out the barn doors into the cold, clean night, as the roof caved in, and the fire ate what was left. Caleb was breathing, burned across the back, a gash on his head, his shoulder wrong somehow, but breathing alive, his eyes open and finding her face in the firelight. "You're hurt," he rasped. "Sarah, the shot did it. It missed. You pushed me clear. You—" She was crying now openly, her hands moving over him, checking, needing to know he was whole. "You put yourself over me. You took the beam, you fool, you beautiful fool. Why would you—" "Because," Caleb said and coughed and gripped her hand hard. "You ran into a burning barn for me first. Seemed only fair." His eyes were wet, and it wasn't the smoke. "Told you I'd say it someday. When it was over and won and you couldn't mistake it." Another cough and a grimace, and then impossibly a smile. "This ain't over and won. But I'm not waiting anymore because I nearly didn't get the chance, and I'll be damned if I let one more day go by without you knowing. I love you, Sarah Dawson. Not the arrangement, not the terms. You, the girl who doesn't run. I don't care what paper your father signed, you're not something I bought. You're the thing I'd have burned that whole barn down myself to keep." His hand tightened on hers. "Say you'll stay. Not because you're bought. Because you choose it. Say you chose to stay." And Eli was there on his knees in the mud beside them, soot black and weeping, gripping his father's other hand, and Clara was in the doorway of the house with Rosie in her arms, and Callahan and the hands stood in a ring around them with their hats off, and the barn burned itself down behind them, and the shooter Thornton had sent was ash in the ruins of it, and the whole terrible night hung waiting on what Sarah Dawson would say. She looked at Caleb Ward, broken and burned and alive, and hers. "I chose to stay the night I fed your children," she said. "I just didn't tell you. I chose it every single day since. I'd have told you when it was safe, when there was nothing hanging over us, when you could be sure I meant it clean." A broken laugh through her tears. "But you're right. We don't get to wait for safe. So here it is in the middle of the worst night of our lives, with your barn burning down. I love you, Caleb Ward. I chose you. I choose you. Nobody gave me to you, and nobody's ever taking me away, because I'm not a thing that gets given anymore. I'm a woman who stayed." And she kissed him there in the mud and the firelight, with his children's hands in theirs, and his whole outfit watching, and Silas Thornton's last card burning to nothing behind them, and it was not the kiss of a girl who'd been sold. It was the kiss of a woman who'd chosen and who'd fought, and who was at long last exactly where she'd decided to be. But even as she held him, even in the middle of it, one cold, clear part of her mind was already moving ahead, because Thornton's man was dead in that barn, and Thornton would know his play had failed within the day, and there were 5 weeks left till spring court, and a desperate man who'd just lost his last quiet option had only loud ones left. The fire hadn't ended it. It had only told Thornton that quiet wouldn't work. And Sarah understood, kissing the man she loved in the ruins of everything they were fighting for, that whatever came next would come in the open now. In daylight in front of the whole valley, that the war had just moved from the shadows into the courtroom, and that she would have to be ready to win it there, in the plain sight of the law, with a wounded husband and a dead shooter, and a clerk's trembling signature, and nothing else but the truth. She held Caleb tighter and watched the barn fall and began already to plan. The shooter had a name. They learned it 2 days after the fire when the county coroner picked through the ashes and found enough to identify a man called Jed Corliss, and Jed Corliss, it turned out, was no drifter. He was on Thornton's payroll, drew wages from the Thornton Land and Cattle Company, and there was a book at the Mercantile in Twin Forks where he'd signed for supplies on the company account not a week before he died in the Ward barn with a rifle in his hands. "That's the mistake," Sarah said, standing over the coroner's report at the kitchen table, while Caleb sat with his bandaged shoulder and his burned back, and watched her with something that was half love and half awe. "That's Thornton's mistake, Caleb. He sent his own man. A man on his own books who signed his own name at the store on the company account. He was so sure it'd work, so sure you'd burn and I'd sign that he got careless. He didn't send a stranger. He sent an employee. And now that employee's dead in our barn with a rifle, and there's a bullet in that beam that matches nothing we own, and a paper trail from the corpse straight back to Silas Thornton's payroll." Caleb shook his head slowly. "A judge'll say Corliss acted alone. That Thornton didn't order it. There's no paper that says go kill Ward. No, Sarah agreed. There isn't. And you're right. If all we had was Corliss, Thornton would wriggle off. He'd weep for the papers, say his poor employee went mad, disavow the whole thing. She leaned on the table. But we don't just have Corliss. We have Corliss and Pruitt's sworn copy of the water claims, and the lapse deadline, and 11 poisoned cattle, and 6 families run off their land, and a clerk ready to testify he was paid to hide it all. One thread, Thornton snaps. But we're not bringing him one thread. We're bringing him the whole rope. And you can't argue your way out of a rope, Caleb. Not in front of a judge who isn't yours. You can only hang from it. Because that was the other thing she'd understood, lying awake the night of the fire with Caleb breathing shallow beside her. Thornton owned the county. He owned Boggs, and he owned Pruitt, or had owned Pruitt, and if they brought this to the county court, they'd lose no matter what the truth was. But Spring Court wasn't the county. Spring Court was the territorial circuit, and the judge who wrote it was a man from the capital named Harlan Cole, who owed Thornton nothing, and had a reputation, Callahan said, for a particular hatred of men who bought their way over other folks. We don't fight him here, Sarah said. We wait. We hold on till the circuit judge comes for Spring Court, and we lay the whole rope in front of a man Thornton can't buy in open court, where the sheriff can't lose the papers and the clerk can't be leaned on because he's under oath. That's the ground we win on, not the county, the territory. Judge Cole. She looked at Caleb. We just have to live till he gets here. 5 weeks. Thornton knows that too, Caleb said quietly. If Judge Cole's the ground you win on, then Thornton's got 5 weeks to make sure you never stand on it. Yes, Sarah said. He does. Thornton came himself 3 days later in daylight in his good black coat, and this time he didn't knock. He rode into the yard with 4 men behind him and Sheriff Boggs at his side, and he sat his horse and looked at the burned ruin of the barn with an expression of such perfect false sorrow that Sarah wanted to be sick. Mr. Ward, he touched his hat. I heard about your fire and your intruder. Terrible business. A man breaks into your barn, sets it alight, and dies in his own blaze, the wickedness of some people. He shook his head. I understand the dead man once did some hauling for my company. Months ago. I let him go, unreliable sort. It grieves me to think he'd do such a thing. But then a discharged man nursing a grudge against the world. He signed your account at the Mercantile last week, Sarah said. Not months ago, last week. Thornton's eyes moved to her, and the sorrow in them cooled. Clerical error, I'm sure. These things happen with a large company. My accounts man will sort it out. He shifted in his saddle. But I didn't ride out here to speak of the dead. I came to offer one final time a way to end all this grief. Mr. Ward, you've lost a barn. Next, it'll be your house, or your children, or your own life. Not by my hand, I'd never. But this is a violent country, and violence finds a man who won't bend. I'm offering to make it stop. My price stands. Take it, sign, and be gone, and let this poor scarred valley have peace. No, Caleb said. Mr. Ward, no. He stood up off the porch step, stiff with his burns, and Sarah stood with him, and Eli came out, and stood on his father's other side, 10 years old, and soot-stained and furious, and Callahan and Dutch, and the hands drifted out from the outbuildings, until there was a line of Ward people facing Thornton's riders across the yard. You want to know why no Thornton? I'll tell you so you never have to ride out and ask again. Caleb's voice was rough, but it carried. Because I know about the river. Thornton went very still. I know about the claims, Caleb said. Every one you filed on the mussel shell top to bottom. I know there's one gap left in your chain and it runs through my land. And I know your whole rotten scheme lapses if you can't close that gap and prove it up before Spring Court opens. He let it land. I know your clock, Thornton. I know why it's always been me. And I know that all I have to do is nothing. Just hold my ground 5 more weeks and let the sun come up on Spring Court, and everything you spent 4 years and a fortune building washes straight down that river and out of your hands forever. So no, I won't sell. I won't bend. I'll just wait. And there's not a thing on God's earth you can do about it that won't put your neck in a noose. The yard was dead silent, and Sarah, watching Thornton's face, saw the exact moment the mask came off, saw the smooth, prosperous regret drain away and leave something underneath it that was pure cold fury. The face of a man who'd built an empire on the certainty that everyone had a price and had just met for the first time people who didn't. "Who told you?" Thornton said softly. "The claims are how could you possibly?" And then his eyes cut to Boggs and to some absent third man, and Sarah watched him arrive at it. "Pruitt. That soft little worm. He showed you the books." His voice dropped to something barely human. "I'll deal with Pruitt. Pruitt's under the protection of the territorial court now." Sarah lied smooth as glass because it wasn't quite true yet, but it would be. She'd make it true. Sworn statement filed with a judge in the Capitol. Copies in 3 places you'll never find. Anything happens to that man, anything at all, a fall, a fever, a stray bullet, and it's read into the record as proof of exactly what he swore. You can't touch him anymore, Thornton. You made him too dangerous to kill. She stepped forward off the porch out into the yard, closer to the mounted man than was safe. And she looked up at Silas Thornton with no fear left in her at all. "It's over. You just don't know it yet. You've got 5 weeks and no move left that doesn't hang you. Every quiet thing you try, we've got the paper to make loud. So go home, count your days, and be in that courtroom spring morning because I promise you we will be." Thornton looked down at her for a long, terrible moment. "You," he said, "were the ruin of this. You know that if Ward had married some soft, frightened thing, some proper meek little bride, I'd have this valley by now and no blood spilled. It was you." His horse sidestepped, feeling his rage through the reins. A girl her own father sold for a debt. That's what beat me." "Yes," Sarah said. "It is. Sit with that a while." And Thornton wheeled his horse and rode out his men behind him, and the dust of them hung in the yard, and Caleb let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a year. "That was either the bravest thing I ever saw," he said, "or the most foolish, walking right up to him." "He can't do anything in daylight in front of your whole outfit," Sarah said. "That's the thing about a man like that. He only works in the dark. Drag him into the light, and he's just a coward in a good coat." But her hands were shaking again now that it was done, and Caleb saw it and drew her against his good side and held her there in the ruined yard, and neither of them said anything for a while. The 5 weeks were the longest of Sarah's life. They lived like a fortress. No one rode alone. The children never left the house without a grown hand watching. Callahan set a rotating watch through every night, and twice they saw riders on the ridges, and once someone tried the well and left a dead thing in it. But Sarah had them draw from the far spring and post a guard, and it came to nothing. Thornton was probing testing, looking for the one gap he could slip a knife through, but they'd sealed every gap, and he found none, and the days ground on toward spring. And in those 5 weeks, in the strange held-breath quiet of a family under siege, something bloomed that Sarah hadn't let herself expect. Caleb healed slow, and while he healed, she read to him. He'd never had time for books, and it turned out he loved to be read to. And in the evenings, she'd sit by his bed with Clara tucked under one arm, and Rosie asleep on her chest, and Eli sprawled on the floor. And she'd read whatever the house had, an old book of poems that had been Margaret's A Farmer's Almanac, the Bible. And Caleb would watch her face in the lamplight instead of listening to the words, and neither of them would say anything about it. One night, Eli asked her apropos of nothing, "Are you going to have a baby? Papa's baby?" Caleb choked. Sarah didn't miss a beat. "Someday, maybe. Would that be all right with you?" Eli considered it with the terrible seriousness of a 10-year-old. "A brother would be all right. Another sister, and I'll go live in the barn." And then quieter, not looking at her. You wouldn't stop being ours if you had one of your own." And Sarah understood the whole enormous fear packed into the question, and she set down the book and looked at him steady. "Eli Ward, you listen to me. There is no such thing as my own in this family, and not my own. I chose every one of you. I chose you in that barn when you were being awful to me. And I chose Clara the first time she asked me if I'd cook, and I chose Rosie the first night I fed her. A baby I might have someday, I won't choose them any more than I chose you, because a person can't love more than all the way. And all the way is what I already love you. You hear me? There's no more than all the way. You've already got the whole of it." Eli's chin trembled, and he got up off the floor and came and pressed his face into her shoulder, and she held him with the arm that wasn't holding the baby, and over his head she found Caleb's eyes wet in the lamplight, and neither of them needed to say a word. That was the night she stopped being their stepmother, if she'd ever really been one. That was the night she just became their mother, quiet without ceremony, the way the truest things happen. Spring Court opened the second Tuesday of April in the Territorial Courthouse at Twin Forks, and Judge Harlan Cole rode in from the Capitol the day before. A lean gray man with cold, clever eyes and a reputation, and Sarah had done her work on him too, had sent Pruitt's sworn statement, and the coroner's report, and a letter in her own careful hand, ahead by fast rider, so that when Judge Cole arrived, he already knew the shape of what was coming, and had Callahan's contacts whispered, read every page twice. Thornton had lawyers, 3 of them up from the Capitol in fine coats. He sat behind them at the front of the crowded courtroom, looking prosperous and untroubled. A wronged man of business, come to settle a tedious property matter. And when Sarah walked in with Caleb on her arm, Caleb still stiff, still scarred, but standing tall, Thornton gave her a small nod, almost admiring the nod of a chess player to the opponent he means to crush. He did not know what was coming, because Sarah had spent 5 weeks building not a defense but a hanging, and she had built it the way she did everything, all the way, leaving nothing out. Thornton's lawyers went first, and they were smooth. They filed the water claims and asked the court to recognize Thornton's rights to the mussel shell, and to compel the Ward parcel, the one gap into Thornton's hands, under some tangle of prior appropriation law that Sarah had spent a month learning to unpick. They painted Caleb as a stubborn holdout obstructing lawful development. They were good. The crowd murmured, and Judge Cole listened with his cold eyes giving away nothing. And when the lawyers finished, he turned to the Ward side and said, "And the respondents, who speaks for the Ward interest?" And Caleb stood and said, "My wife does, Your Honor. She knows it better than any lawyer we could afford, and she's the one who found the truth of it. By your leave she'll speak." The courtroom rustled. A woman. Judge Cole's eyebrow rose a fraction, and then to the surprise of everyone but Sarah, who'd read every account of the man she could find, he said, "This is a court of law, not custom. If she knows the facts, she may speak, Mrs. Ward." Sarah stood. She did not raise her voice. She'd learned long ago that the quiet voice is the one people lean in to hear. She laid it out plain and cold, and in order the whole rope, thread by thread. The claims she filed Pruitt's certified copy, and walked the judge down the mussel shell claim by claim, showing the chain, showing the gap. The lapse deadline, she cited the very statute Thornton's own lawyers relied on, and showed how it cut both ways, how his claims died if the chain wasn't whole, and proved by this session. The 6 families, she'd tracked down 2 of them, and they were there in the gallery, and they stood when she named them, and told in their own broken words of fouled water and cut fences and prices that dropped every month they refused to sell. The poisoned cattle, the coroner's report, and then Jed Corliss. Thornton's own man on Thornton's own books, dead in the Ward barn, with a rifle and a bullet in a beam that matched nothing the Wards owned. On the very night the Ward barn burned in 3 places at once, with the smell of coal oil under the smoke. Thornton's lawyers objected. Objected and objected. And each time Judge Cole overruled them colder, and Sarah saw the smoothness start to crack on the fine Capitol faces, and she saw Thornton lean forward, and she saved the last thread for the end. "And so I'd ask the court to consider," she said, "not just whether Mr. Thornton holds a valid claim to the mussel shell. He does not. His chain is broken, and his deadline is upon him. And by this court's own reckoning of the statute, his claims lapse the moment this session closes, without that gap made whole. But I'd ask the court to consider why that gap was never closed. 4 years, Your Honor. 4 years he had, and a fortune, and the willingness to poison and burn and buy men's souls. and in 4 years he could not close one gap because one family would not sell, would not bend, would not be frightened or bought or burned out. She turned and looked at Silas Thornton, and her voice never rose. He told me himself in my own yard 3 days after his man burned my barn that I was the ruin of it. That if my husband had married some soft, frightened bride, he'd have the whole valley by now and no blood spilled. He said a girl beat him. A girl her own father sold for a debt. She looked back at the judge. I'll own that gladly, but I'd ask the court to hear what it means. It means every family in this valley was one stubborn holdout away from keeping their homes. It means Silas Thornton's whole empire rested on the certainty that everyone can be moved if you push the right way hard enough. And it means he built it all the claims, the fires, the murder on that one rotten belief. So let this be the record of it. Let it be written down where every man like him can read it, that here in this valley that belief broke. That some things aren't for sale. That a girl who was sold refused once and for all, and in front of the law, to accept that any human being can be traded like a debt, or run off their own ground by a man with a checkbook and a hired gun. Strike his claims. Return this valley to the families he robbed. And let Silas Thornton answer in this court for the barn and the murder and the ruin he brought to honest people. That's what I'd ask. That's all of it. That's the truth, and I've put every thread of it in your hands. She sat down. The courtroom was so silent she could hear the wind against the windows. Judge Harlan Cole looked at her for a long moment over his cold, clever eyes. Then he looked at the certified claims and the coroner's report and the 2 ruined families standing in his gallery. And he looked longest of all at Silas Thornton's fine 3 lawyers and the prosperous man behind them who had gone at last the color of ash. "I've heard enough," said Judge Cole. "Keck." He ruled that afternoon. He struck every one of Thornton's water claims, not merely lapsed, but voided, obtained, he said, through a pattern of fraud and coercion that made a mockery of the appropriation laws they leaned on. He ordered the river restored to the common right of every landholder along it. He ordered the parcels bought from the runoff families reviewed for fraud, and 2 of them returned outright to the men in the gallery who wept. And on the matter of the barn, and the man Corliss, and the payroll that led back to the Thornton Company, he did not rule himself. He was a civil judge, he said, and this was a matter for a criminal court, but he ordered the whole of the evidence. Pruitt's testimony, and the coroner's report, and Corliss's company wages, referred to the territorial marshal out of the county, out of Boggs's reach, up to men Thornton had never bought. Silas Thornton was arrested on the courthouse steps within the month, and Sheriff Boggs a week after him, and the clerk Pruitt turned state's evidence and told all of it, every fire and every fouled spring and every family in the trial ran through the summer, and Thornton went to the territorial prison at Deer Lodge for the rest of a natural life that Sarah privately hoped would be a long one, so he'd have time to sit with it, with the girl her own father sold who beat him. But that was all still to come that April afternoon. That April afternoon, they rode home. They rode home in this wagon in the long spring light, all of them, Caleb, driving with his healed shoulder and Sarah beside him, and the 3 children piled in the back, and the valley opened out green and thawing around them, the mussel shell running high and free with snowmelt, their river, now everyone's river, no man's chokehold, and nobody spoke for a long while, because some things are too full for talking. Then Clara from the back said, "Are we going to build a new barn?" "We are," Caleb said. "A better one. This summer." "Can I help?" said Eli. "You'll do more than help. You held that beam up off me and your ma with your own shoulder, son. You'll drive the first nail." And Eli sat back satisfied, a boy who'd carried a mountain of guilt into that barn a season ago and come out the other side of the fire, a person who'd saved his father's life. And Sarah watched him settle and watched Clara lean against him, and felt Rosie's small warm weight asleep against her own chest, and she thought her heart might not hold it all. Caleb reached over and took her hand on the wagon seat. "I've been thinking," he said low so the children wouldn't hear about that first morning, over coffee, "when you made me promise what you built here was yours." He kept his eyes on the road. I signed it as terms. A bargain. I thought that's all it could ever be because I thought the part of me that could do more than a bargain was in the ground under that cottonwood with Margaret. A pause. I was wrong. It wasn't in the ground. It was just frozen. And you thought it out, Sarah, same as you thought everything else in that cold house, and I never even felt it happen till it was done. I know, Sarah said softly. I felt the same. I came here to survive, and I stayed to love you. And I couldn't tell you exactly when it turned because it didn't turn. It grew slow like everything real does. So I want to say it once more, Caleb said. Now that it's over and won and there's nothing hanging over us and you can't mistake it for the fire talking or the fear talking or anything, but the plain daylight truth. He stopped the wagon right there in the middle of their own free valley and turned to look at her full in the face. I choose you, Sarah Ward. Not the paper your father signed. I'd tear that paper up and marry you fresh tomorrow, with nothing bought and nothing owed, just a man and a woman standing up in front of God and saying it clean. Nobody gave you to me. You stayed. And you fought, and you saved my children and my land and my sorry frozen life, and you did it all as a free woman who chose it every single day. That's the only marriage I want, the chosen kind. His voice roughened. Will you marry me again for real this time, for nothing for love? And Sarah Ward, 18 years old, who had been given away on a cold porch like a debt paid in flesh, who had refused to stay bought, who had walked into a burning barn and a crooked courtroom, and never once run, looked at the man she had chosen. In a valley she had saved with the children she had claimed asleep and safe behind her, and she began at last to laugh and to cry both at once. Ask me 100 times, she said. The answer's the same every time. And it always will be, because it's the only thing in my whole life I ever got to choose freely, and I'd choose it again in front of anyone. Yes, Caleb Ward. Yes. Not because I was given. Because I stayed. He kissed her there in the wagon in the spring light, and behind them Eli groaned and covered Clara's eyes, and Clara giggled, and the baby slept on, and the free river ran bright through the valley they had kept, and the long shadow of the dead woman under the cottonwood was not a haunting anymore, but only what it should have been all along, a love that had come before, honored and laid to rest, making room at last for the love that came after. Sarah Dawson had been sold to survive. Sarah Ward chose to stay, and in the staying, she did not just save a ranch, or beat a wicked man, or raise 3 grieving children into whole ones. Though she did all of that, she proved the one thing the whole cruel frontier had told her was impossible, that no human being is ever truly for sale, that the deepest kind of belonging is never bought or bartered or forced, but chosen freely by 2 people standing as equals, and that a family built on that choice, on trust and courage and love that stays when it could run, is stronger than any deed, any fortune, any fire, and cannot be taken by any man alive. And no one ever bought or sold Sarah Ward again.